Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back, listeners, and welcome, Don, to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Today, we have Don Kane, which I'll allow him to introduce himself here shortly, but kind of in the same space that I've been in, and really, the term digital twin. Really, what is it? What does it mean? And, how can it help transform and be a part of this grid modernization journey that we all talk about? So we do talk about modeling data, understanding the distribution grid, full situational awareness, but we also as an industry love to throw buzzwords around. So I thought it'd be great to have Don on today to kind of give us a little bit of grounding and put some stakes in the ground as we explore this topic. So Don, thank you for wanting to show up and share your journey. Why don't we give our listeners a little introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Liz. Appreciate the opportunity to come on and, like you say, fairly often exercise my inner nerd, specifically about the electric distribution system data and the model. My name is Don Kane. I'm a principal engineer with TRC Companies. TRC does consulting, engineering, project management, construction, the whole nine yards across multiple industries, including the T&D system. I've been with TRC now for about 2 years. The bulk of my career was spent with Eversource Energy in Connecticut, and pretty much all in the planning and operations environment for the T&D system, and primarily the distribution system. A lot of that, especially over the last 10, 15 years of my career there, was spent in trying to automate the creation of distribution models, accurate distribution models, using the various systems available in the company. And this includes things like the GIS, the Geographic Information System, and the various databases.
Holy Grail.
That's right. There's much more to it than that. And there's a number of systems that exist digitally, ideally, but a number of them don't still. And incorporating that information into the model is a challenge, and we can get into some of that as we go along.
Yeah. For our listeners, especially those that may not be in the utility industry, I think just from a ecosystem of support and partnerships that surround, the utilities are the ones obligated and regulated to maintain a safe, reliable, affordable service to all. And within that, there's a certain amount of full-time employees that are ultimately, living and breathing, showing up each day, working for the utility. But, when you really get down into it, and I think that's one of the reasons why I show up for the Grid Mod Pod and really to educate and inform not only internal utility folk, but external, is that there's an enormous amount of effort and analytics and understanding that must be happening in near real time. So you really need to have those partnerships that can really augment the expertise, because if you're a listener and you're here often, there's a significant amount of pieces of equipment that we've connected and interconnected and really rely on. So, when you said TRC, your organization, and you had, your original journey was within the utility, you ultimately you're there to kind of come back and support the utilities themselves effectively executing these robust, large analytical studies that knowledge base needs to grow within. And then also the expertise can then go to multiple utilities of support. So I just think it's, from a outsider looking in, like, who are these consultants? And B, the expertise, the knowledge base of many decades is something that is much desired across many utilities as, the utilities have evolved. Anyway, just want to give a shout out to, how you're taking that expertise and taking it on the road. It's really important to keep the
Sure. And I should also clarify, Liz, with TRC, I work in the Power System Studies group. And so primarily what we're doing is supporting a lot of electric distribution companies with capacity planning studies, reliability improvement, and a lot of DER integration studies on the T&D system. Again, I'm focused primarily on the distribution system.
Yeah, and I guess I just get a shout out because that was my original 12 years being a power system engineering analysis support role for utilities. I would, we all say consultant, but there's many layers of that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
building the models, running the studies, determining the analytics, and then providing that insight to those that really need it to take action on it. So I find that, I felt comfort in Don Kane coming on to talk. So I'm going to tee that up with, we use the word, 2 words, digital twin. What is, like, break it down. You kind of did in your intro, but a digital twin, and then how you see what it was, maybe give a perspective of where we were, and then how it's evolving into what probably you and I know it's headed. So.
Yeah. So the digital twin, I mean, on its surface, yeah, it's a kind of a virtual digital representation of a physical system. And with the distribution system, that certainly applies. And I think a lot of people think of it as the GIS, the Geographic Information System, that, has all the assets, all the equipment, where they are geographically, how they're interconnected. And certainly, that's a big part of it. There's plenty of other elements that make up the digital twin. And those elements are, they're growing. The amount of data that's involved is it's expanding rapidly, especially, over the last 10 years, let's say. It's increased tremendously, and it's going to keep increasing. I kind of break down the categories of information in the digital twin as it applies to the distribution system, into assets, which, are all the equipment, the conductors, and that includes their location, their connectivity, etc. But then you have other things that may not be in the GIS, things like equipment settings, right? The kind of the flexible attributes of the assets that are out there. Those attributes can change depending on what the utility wants to do with that particular equipment. So think things like, voltage set points on regulators and load tap changers, control logic for capacitors on the system that determine when they turn on and off. Stuff like that. That often exists in a variety of data stores within the utility. And a lot of times they're not easily accessed by an automated system to build the model. Another category I like to think is more on the grid edge, on the customer side. What happens beyond the meter, right? And it's not just customer load anymore. It's not just a kilowatt hour reading. You've got generation on the other side of that meter now. That can be significant, right, for larger customers and for distributed generation that's there just to generate. You've got battery systems there now that have a lot of functionality to them. And plus, the amount of data that's there is growing rapidly. Advanced metering infrastructure is now, instead of a single monthly kilowatt hour read for a customer, you might have 5 or 15 minute data that's captured for not just energy usage, voltage and some other things. And to store all that is huge. And then to do something with it is also a huge challenge, right? Another category I would put in the realm of, on the electric distribution system, kind of the operations data, the SCADA data that's being captured, real time, and historical. But what's the status of all the equipment up there? What's the real time power flows and voltage and all the information that we're using to make decisions on what to do, or in a lot of cases, automated decisions about how the grid should operate, right? So those are kind of the broader categories. And then within each of those, you have a myriad of a very deep subset of data that you can get into. So the way I like to describe the distribution digital twin, it's extremely broad and it's very deep in some places. And so it's important to understand that.
And I think, one of the biggest challenges of grid modernization is, we also took 2 words, put them together. We speak a lot about grid modernization. Depending on how you're first introduced to the term, you create, a series of ideas or perspective of what you believe it to be. And so everything you kind of laid out, in my opinion, and I've been on this journey, I think probably just with you, is grid modernization is really the phenomena of understanding the people and the processes that need to be upskilled, reskilled, educated, and then also assessing like current processes and why those processes ultimately need to change to have something like a digital twin. And, we can go into the transmission space, right, where we tied those grids together starting really late 70s, 80s into the 90s. And at the same time, that's when we were introduced to SCADA and computers became available, and, having data that can run computation, every 4 minutes is kind of what the transmission grid runs at, which fundamentally, if you think about it, where we're headed in the distribution grid, 4 minutes is quote unquote real time, but it's actually near real time. And I joke about that because we could spend a whole debate, probably you and I, on quantifying what is real time and what is near real time. And really, what you were laying out there in my mind was, depending on the phenomena or the particular initiative or action that you want to understand the impacts of, requires certain latency and a certain amount of information at a certain period of time. And so that scales, right? So it's really hard for, to kind of that high level synopsis, because you probably don't want to leave out, well, you kind of need this for that, but you don't really need that for that. And then that's kind of, I think, where the complexity comes into, is how do we break those silos down and educate the ultimate goal? And I think that's part of the journey. So that's why you and I are here. So anyway, just a little perspective.
Yep, absolutely.
So, from your experience, I bet, how have you seen it evolve, or what are some good use cases where a group or a pod of engineers or, operators didn't have something of sorts, and then, evolved and created a said digital twin? What impacts and what processes were touched?
There's plenty, because, there's grid modernization in general. It's all about dealing with a couple of parallel forces that are happening all at the same time. You've got expectations of customers and regulators and just the general public. Their expectations for what the utilities can provide are increasing, right? The tolerance for power outages is, the tolerance is decreasing, right? And the expectations increasing. The need to operate the grid in a more near real-time mode, like you're describing. And you're right, we could have that discussion forever. When you've got a massive amount of distributed generation on the grid that's intermittent in nature, and you've got circuits that have 2 or 3 or 4 times the generation than they have load, what is the real-time power flow through a particular device, right? Having to operate the system with this challenge of rapidly changing conditions on the grid forces the need for some different tools. And so I think a good example of the transition of operating the distribution grid in the past, kind of the primary operating requirements of the grid just required the dispatch center to know what portions of the distribution system are energized and what are not, and to know from an outage management perspective, where do I have to send a crew in order to fix that problem? Also, again, what parts are de-energized? If there's a crew working out there, how do I set up that safe work environment, right? What are the devices that represent the boundaries of that zone? And that was kind of the main requirement for operating the grid. But now we're getting to a point where we need to start managing not just lights on, lights off, but voltage levels and, power flows. And again, those intermittent power flows. How do we deal with power flowing one way at noon because the sun's out and flowing a different direction a couple hours later? It's not just the customer load that's changing, it's the generation on the distribution system. And in order to manage, things like voltage on the grid, we've got to have much better control and knowledge of what all the different voltage regulating equipment out there is, what it's doing on its own, and how we can control it to keep customer voltage within an acceptable band. You start going down the road of what's called a advanced distribution management system, an ADMS. So, in the old days, it was an OMS, outage management. We're moving towards an ADMS. The ADMS requires a vast amount of additional information, accurate information, right? And we don't just care about connectivity of the circuit. We care about things like conductor size and step transformer connections and regulator settings and capacitor control types, all this kind of stuff, as well as the attributes of the distributed generation that's out there. It's a lot more. So,
and that's kind of where the education and the commitment of those that are really leading the subsets of those groups. Like, I followed you, and I'm just going to take a moment for our listeners, like all the data you spoke of, like we started with the GIS, which is fundamentally the assets themselves and how they're connected to each other. So your transformers, where your substations are, even some conductor data. Historically, it wasn't as if all GIS systems maintained the conductor information. If so, it was in another system that you kind of had to mirror up. But that's evolving. But then you also have some of the other equipment, like your relays, your fuses, your switches. But the GIS in general was for, equipment data, the age, the condition, and kind of some ratings, right? And it was there for a purpose, and it served a great purpose. And what you then kind of reeled into was the ADMS, Advanced Distribution Management System, which is really another term that kind of came across our industry, what would you say, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Much more aggressive is probably a bad word, but on the tip of everyone's tongue that really, desired this dynamic operation of a distribution grid. So let's just say 7 years ago. But within that is incorporating the SCADA data, right? The telemetry data, and then even further incorporating the AMI data. That in itself is a heavy lift. You have to, work with multiple teams within the utility to say, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why. And oh, by the way, it's going to cost some money and we're probably going to need more people. So these systems you can't just turn them on. There has to be a vision, there has to be an execution map, and then you have to hire the people that know how to do it to move it through. But on top of that, you mentioned the outage management data, right? You also, kind of from a planning perspective, and then, you even slipped in there the protection and control guys. Those are all subsets of data that is being put into this mass model. And in a space that, would you say, from your experience, has greatly evolved? Do you recall a time of using, I don't know, I'm not going to age you, but paper maps to possibly the space of using an ADMS? And just what kind of lessons learned or case value did you see from that experience?
I think paper maps are still used, I think, to a certain extent in a lot of operation centers and even by planning engineers.
Right.
Earlier in my career, and yeah, I don't mind being aged a little bit here, but building distribution models on the computer, it was really kind of a new thing when I first started, in 1987. And it was really cool, but it would take a week of effort to build a semi-geographic distribution model, that was generalized quite a bit. It was a huge amount of effort. And within a year or two, that particular model was kind of out of date because nobody's keeping that particular model updated with changes that occur on the system, with new customers connecting, customers leaving or going out of business, whatever, changes made to the distribution system, a new capacitor bank goes up or whatever.
Right.
So building those models was a tremendous amount of work to do one thing, to do one
circuit, you just said. Which
one
if you have
circuit.
1,000 circuits, you're kind of...
Right. So it's the magnitude of elements and models that you need to do. But even within those models, in order to automate that and really, use the system, in some cases, all of the data needs to be correct. Or you've got to have some strategies for working around those little gaps in the data or the things that are obviously wrong, So a typical circuit in GIS, it probably has thousands of little line sections in it, right? And so each one of those needs to have the correct information. And often there's little gaps and sections that you don't know what the conductor size is, or it's something ridiculously different from the section next to it or around it. And so you've got to have strategies for dealing with that. That's really a lot about the skill set that's kind of required to deal with the digital twin. And it's how do you deal with this massive amount of data, and what strategies can you implement to work with that, knowing it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect, right? But you've got to try to get it improved to a point where it's good enough to do whatever use case you want to do with it.
Which, just that statement, good enough, is very hard statement to champion and to, put your heels on the ground, right? So like, if you think about it, you as a distribution planner and engineer, when you first started your career and even up to like 5 years ago, there's a genuine respect that your planners, like their life's goal is to build a very accurate model as best they can and run the analytics and allow the information to speak to them. And so like from this mass, enablement of technology and data, and I'm just kind of maybe speaking from my own experience, right? Like there's this huge expectation of all these external stakeholders to like want you to be open and transparent and be able to answer every question up, down, left, right from a scenario planning perspective. But if you don't have the systems in place, we got to like lean into the basics of the physical grid and the response that we can. And by the way, we've done a great job. We built this massive machine that, and we've understood the flow of electrons and how to mitigate those really for the last 140 years. And it's just this last 7 years, there's this demand for really that open book planning perspective and then that open book real-time operations, which I think is just a struggle, right? Like, there's an enormous amount of work that used to be done, and now you can eliminate that work, but we can't eliminate it without knowing the repercussions of what all those pieces of data that you just spoke of.
That's right. And and kind of a good example of that, of being aware of the fact that the model that you're looking at, the results you're seeing are probably not perfect. And I tell a lot of the junior engineers that I work with, when they're producing a report or showing results of a load flow model, let's say, don't show me voltage that goes to like 3 decimal places of accuracy, okay? Because in the real world, you're kind of estimating what the voltage is at a certain point on the circuit. And that's going to be like, give or take, a couple percent, So to say that the voltage is 120.23 at one location, it's between 119 and 121 at best. We've got to have some realism about what the level of accuracy that we're talking about here,
Actually, if you think of, just another fun fact, thinking about where the grid was, when we first built it, the ability to measure and like sense to that granular decimal wasn't available. So it was built in a very conservative, overbuilt fashion, which we've been actually leaning on that conservancy probably for the last 80 years. And now with all of this awareness that we can be that granular, does that change the philosophy of how you're rating your equipment and your design? I mean, it really is very complex. But I just think about, I keep thinking of the transmission grid, but like NERC, which is North American Electric Reliability Corporation, they're the standards organization that governs the transmission owners and generation, right? The bulk electric system. There's a point to this. But I remember, getting really involved in FAC 008, which was about the ratings. And what that meant is that every transmission owner had to ensure that their facility ratings were based on sound engineering principles, right? Like sound engineering principles. So, there was a set of another documents of sound engineering principles, or, an IEEE or like a C grade, right? Like a whole organization that are effectively like, what are the right assumptions and initial conditions that we can create a process to rate all of these pieces of equipment? That started happening from a best practices 80, 90 years ago. So anyway, you go into, you're ensuring the equipment's rated for its thermal and its mechanical capabilities, and it gets really detailed. And there's an enormous amount of data that needs to be maintained. Very static. So as a system planning manager, I remember like, oh my goodness, like this is an enormous, responsibility. And the tool sets that we have are kind of limited. And so then when you I looked, into the distribution grid. I was like, well, what do we do for the distribution grid? right? I mean, so thinking about what you just said, all of that information that was once in these silos serving a purpose based on assumptions and sound engineering principles from 80, 90 years ago are now being pressure cooked. And that one engineer that used to take 40 hours to build one model that would be good for a year is now being asked to run all of these analyses in like one day. Anyway, so that's like the ever importance of, I think, why the digital twin and the necessity of that is becoming such a big topic. And yeah.
Absolutely. To follow on that, Liz, it's, traditionally things like ratings of equipment and conductors, transmission line conductors, it was static and it was very conservative, right? The underlying requirement back then was don't melt the conductor. We're not going to get anywhere near the melting point of the conductor, right? Now, there's more pressure, there's more expectation to get as much bang for the buck of that conductor as possible. And we're going to the point of, flexible ratings based on the weather conditions, right? Based on the temperature and the wind speed, which adds kind of a different element to the digital twin. Maybe what are the weather conditions around? What's the temperature, the humidity, the solar irradiance, all that kind of stuff at each particular point where you have equipment, and how does that impact the operation of the grid?
And we're learning, even I think another driver or objective of the Grid Mod Pod is education. I think a lot of the distributed energy resources, these new technologies that everyone has an opinion on in regards to solar, wind, battery energy storage, I think if we really peel back the onion, it was just, I think, if in a very powerful way, open Pandora's box on, it's not, weather doesn't just impact those devices. Weather impacts a lot of the assets. However, because we've been doing our due diligence and basing our engineering sound principles on information that we wouldn't have been able to incorporate when we first made these initial conditions. And well, now here we are, we're actually seeing weather can impact how the conductor operates, right? For one example. So it's like another journey. Like, it's not just for this new gadgets and gizmos, it's for the baseline performance of the existing assets.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, customer load is impacted. It's always been impacted by the weather. right?
Like, how dare we do an analysis to determine, what is the load impact based on varying temperatures? And could we help our customers better understand how they're using energy during certain weather conditions to offset the cost to them? How dare we take that? So, it's been definitely an evolving conversation. I think that's another area, right, we could debate. So
absolutely. And how about electric vehicle charging? Add that to the whole mix, right? It's not just weather, it's driving conditions and so.
Or for instance, HVAC, right? For those that have systems that may be outdated, old, or, running at the end of life, when it gets cold or it gets hot, those go down double duty. They're pulling more. And I'm not even just talking about energy efficiency, just the phenomena of what's happening the way we used to, right? If we could create analytics based on digital twins to study the usage of various pockets of the grid, you could propose programs that help offset that double amount. Hey, when you have a 20 degree and lower, just so you know, your bill is going to be XY. And we've seen that kind of materialize in pockets, but grounded in the actual near real time simulation is where we're headed, is the value of a lot of, I think, of this journey in itself.
Sure.
I just got nerdy on you. So
bring it on, Liz.
From your experience, working with your clients and just, your team itself, what skills and or systems do you think are critical to really maybe open a book or take a class or lean in a little bit extra on a lecture around enabling digital twins and leveraging them for planning operations of utility? What have you seen?
So one of the most important skill sets, I think, in the electric utility industry now is to be able to kind of ride that edge between information technology systems and operation technology systems. Okay. IT, OT. No longer can we have an IT department over there that takes care of all the databases and the systems, and they maintain the systems. And over here, we've got people that manage the grid. We're already at a point where we really need a lot of people who kind of understand enough about both systems to be able to improve the underlying aspects of the digital twin and to build systems that are capable of managing and maintaining those systems and understanding what are the most important elements for any particular use case and what are the elements where, they're not that important, because improving everything that all aspects of the digital twin to perfect accuracy is a pipe dream. It's just, that's not going to happen in any of our lifetimes, and probably nor should it. There's just too many elements. So it's really getting to an understanding of what are the really important underlying data requirements of whatever system or systems that you're involved in, being able to translate that into how the systems work and what's really needed for them. That's one of the most important things. And the utility industry, I think, they're still kind of catching up to this.
Yeah, when we say utility industry, for instance, and what I heard you say is like understanding the IT, OT, and I'll just throw in cyber relationship. Like those groups in themselves are an entity. They can't be replaced. They actually have relationships with each other. And I think that's one thing that has been misguided, not just in my opinion, I've observed, is this IT, OT, and convergence discussion, which would mean that you'd have less, but really it's what you just said is the education of the necessity of what each of those do and how they integrate and interact with each other. And then what the important part is from a utility is like you have your executive leadership, right? You have your senior management, like those folk need to understand, not like in great deal, but just enough to be dangerous so that they're setting up their teams for success. And there isn't this competitive silo nature, but this symbiotic reality that all need to exist, especially as they explore. And I guess I'll also say, and probably the reason why I'm here and geeking out with you is for the external stakeholders, our advocacy groups and our regulators and like the commission staff, like there are these systems that are required to do all of these things that our customers are demanding. And so how do we effectively communicate and then drive that change? It's a complex situation. And I think there's a bunch of us like you out there, helping, but I love that you brought that relationship up.
Sure. I think from a senior leadership perspective in the industry, I think one of the most important requirements there is just to really have a good, honest understanding of where they are, where their company is with the maturity level of some of these underlying databases and systems. I think some people might think they have a GIS, so that's the requirement for feeding this other system, without really understanding that there is a massive effort required to get the accuracy of certain aspects of that GIS up to a point where you can be confident that the system that it's feeding is going to operate the way you want it. And I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of examples of really significant IT system implementations that have been ground to a halt when they discover that the data that's going to be coming into this is not adequate, and fixing it is going to require a walk down, like a physical walk down of your entire system, and then documenting that data and, doing something with that data and getting it into the system. Having a good, honest understanding of that and being able to argue for the effort to make that improvement. Because, cleaning up these data systems, it's dirty, time-consuming, expensive work. And it's
right.
it's
80% of the lift. So you
really
got to do that before you can launch into all the stuff.
Your whole your discussion there with Dr. Valentine a couple weeks ago, where you talked about the pyramid, right? The 80-20 pyramid and that solid data foundation, right? Because, like I said, making these improvements to the underlying databases, it's a very unsexy thing to propose to your regulators. right? State
Or your
regulators,
customers, yeah.
they're assuming that, the data systems that the utilities have are all up to snuff. Making all those detailed improvements, it's difficult, it's expensive. So, being able to have an understanding of where you're at and being able to argue for and defend the expense necessary to make those improvements.
And I think, it's all the part of the process too. So we are where we are, but we would need to understand where we were. We understand where we are, like you said, and then be able to champion and communicate where we ought to go. And I think that's in all things in life. So that's kind of grid mod,
Absolutely.
from a human perspective. Well, it's been great. I've been leaving the conversations kind of with a wrap-up question. Really, from your experience and knowledge and really the journey you've been in this industry, what are some traits or maybe lessons learned that you've taken and you would tell your younger self as you're embarking on the industry? What are some, shares for those listeners that are actively listening and want to learn, and how do they take part in this transformation?
Well, I think, from very early on, my guidance to myself might have been stay out of the electric utility industry, if you really want to make a lot of money. But seriously, it's something I've really kind of truly enjoyed. One of the things I would definitely recommend is making connections with other people that have, other expertise, other types of expertise that are going to be necessary to intertwine. Okay, like the example I gave before. If, I'm an engineer and I'm operating the grid, I'm really going to have to maybe step out of my comfort zone a little bit and understand more about what's going on the information technology side. Maybe I do need to understand what a database is, that it's not a spreadsheet, right? And the fact that the digital twin is really not a picture of the whole model. It's a bunch of databases, a bunch of massive databases that, need to be integrated at some point. You've got to step into that a little bit. And I think by the same token, the folks on the information technology side that are supporting the operations of the grid, having a better understanding of the why and what is it that they're trying to do with this information is really important to understand, because like we said, a number of things don't need to be perfect. They need to be good enough, So if I'm working on the IT side, how do I get it to a point where it's good enough? Or how do I explain to the engineers what they need to do to get this data to be good enough, right?
And I guess I'll summarize your thoughts again. Well, one, what you just stated is a process, which I don't think we really educate the next workforce or even our younger students that are in grade school is, challenging the status quo and asking the questions as you execute, the structured education is, something that is to be happening. So like for an engineer, you have to pick an initial condition, you have to design your assumptions, then you got to document it. Like there's a process that's all being taught. And I think it gets lost once you get up you're speaking to the executives of how much effort and knowledge was shared to get to that point. And I have to, just because I finished this book, and you said it about your younger self, don't go in the utilities because of the financial wealth. There's a book I just read, and to my listeners and to you, it's Sahil Bloom. It was the 5 Types of Wealth, the transformative guide to design your dream life. And my mother bought it for my son who's about to go, graduate from high school. And I thought it was beautiful because, there's this focus on financial wealth, but he really breaks down the physical wealth, mental wealth, social wealth, which you did say, the networks, the relationships, the value of them, and realizing they are real, right? And so if you're surrounding yourself with an industry that is keeping the lights on for the life, of all, I mean, how much more purpose could you have? And then ultimately time wealth, which was the 5th. But anyway, I think that's what you said, Don, is, those networks, those relationships, and really just understanding, you're doing great things when you're in this industry.
Sounded a lot better than the way I said it, but yes, I agree.
And I guess I wanted to plug the book because it was really good. I just kind of wrapped it up. Recency. Okay, well, I love this. Thank you. I look forward to hearing about your journey in the future of your digital twins that you're helping the other utilities embark on. And with that, thanks, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the Grid Mod Pod.
Happy to be here. Thanks again, Liz.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.